Pricing is more than a number. The number itself in the contract doesn't really matter to me, but as legal, the whole framework around that is super important. I'm Frédérique Joos. I'm partner at Cambrian. We're an Antwerp-based law firm specialized in technology and innovation companies. And I had the technology team. So we assist companies day to day in their commercial and technology drafting.
When we talk about pricing, should a founder have a discussion with legal before thinking about pricing?
Yes. And for me, on two levels. I think the first level is something that a founder typically thinks about, is how do I talk to my legal to translate what we sold on a PowerPoint into the contract, and how would that work? But also on a second level, I think one of the biggest challenges in pricing and contracting is how are we going to address pricing through time? So in most instances, it's quite clear for the founder how he sells it on day one. And of course, they want to have a commitment of 2, 3, 4, 5 years. They have a product that evolves over 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And then the big question is, how does our pricing evolve throughout that term? And that contracting is everything. It's also a bit managing expectations, especially if you're selling towards B2B, very large procurement departments. They are heavily focused on A, how is pricing introduced into the contract on day one? And B, how can we squeeze little startup over time into that pricing?
And then suppose after that you want to change your pricing, you're thinking about changing that. How do you approach that then from a legal perspective?
Well, it depends on what is in contract, especially if, as said, you went through a very tough negotiation with procurement, for example. They will have that fully contained and will try to get every freedom to readdress your pricing into the contract. But of course, as a startup, as a founder, you have the advantage, you're working with an evolving product. And one of the big levers you have is functionality, for example. If you are able to make sure that in your contract, you're not promising any future functionalities within the same pricing, you could focus on which additional modules, which additional functionality can I get into that contract to reopen my price negotiation. Because in essence, if the scoping is right, you're reselling a new product. And then you can talk about pricing again.
Yeah, and then that opens the door again.
Yes.
For you. So being creative on the packaging side.
And you're turning the debate from a demand into an offer. You're bringing new functionality and you're reopening your pricing discussion instead of I come to the table asking to reopen my pricing discussion.
But you said it already, a lot of startups prefer those longer term contracts from a cash flow perspective, potentially upfront. But the ideal situation, what would be that for them? Is there something that you said this?
I think in a perfect situation, you're able to get a long commitment, but also already with a roadmap in your mind, not in the contract, but in your mind, how to evolve your product and your pricing, to be able to really leverage that longer commitment of the customer into a broader commercial commitment on pricing as well. The thing, of course, is, and that's typically where you end up starting off with the ideal situation of a long commitment, but during negotiation, it tends to turn into a very asymmetrical situation where you feel that you as a founder are asked to commit on pricing, and the customer has on paper some kind of commitment, but if you focus in on that, it isn't a symmetric commitment. They can walk away, they can demand you to offer better pricing, for example, even the most aggressive, most favored nation clauses and things like that. But on your side, you're committed to that long term and to that pricing. And that's a very asymmetric situation. And there it's very important, because what we tend to see in long negotiation phases is you start off with a proposal or a PowerPoint with 2, 3 slides, and then there's a pricing and there's a commitment, a term, 2, 3, 4 years. But no details. And you start off with then, okay, I sold 3 years at this pricing, fantastic. But then you enter into the translation of your proposal of 3 pages into a contract of 40 or 50 or 100 pages. And then the customer starts to hollow out its own commitment and asking more commitment on your side. And that's an important point in time to be very close with the founder and legal, to just keep the eye on the deal and know what are we giving and what are we demanding.
Yeah. Because it can be tiresome for a founder.
Yeah, if you go into the debate and you still have your own 2-3 slides in your mind and this is the deal, you might end up with a different deal at the end when you sign. So that's very important to keep the eye on the transaction and to see what is the commercial commitment we're willing to give and what is the commercial commitment we're asking our customer.
And from a market perspective, are there specific markets it would be easier for me to do business with, thinking about legal? Because
of course, the closer you can be as a founder on the very large SaaS pay-as-you-go models, the easier you sell. Because there you're in a model where people are just registering, accepting terms and conditions, and ending up with a monthly invoice. That's an easy situation. If you move up to other sectors where you have procurement departments, if you're working for pharma, if you're working for industry, then you start off with a big contract, and then you start up with having to negotiate very heavily on the pricing framework and the terms that are applicable to that pricing. And also in a context where industries sometimes are asking things that are very uncommon for software or technology vendors. For example, in older industries, it's not uncommon to ask your suppliers to keep on focusing on margins and to be able to push the price down, and as a customer benefit from that lowering of price. If you go into procurement agreements of 150 pages, there might be a clause in that says, okay, if you're using raw materials and the price goes down, we need to benefit as well from that margin going down. And of course, translating that to a software business is diametrical to what you're accustomed to. So if you can stay very close to standard terms of use, very easy and understandable pricing, you're making your life a bit easier. But it's not a choice that founders typically make on the offset, because of course there is also nice business to do if you work together with industry or pharma or biotech.
True. But then you have to think about pricing power and also take that complexity into...
Exactly, and already do that exercise yourself. Because negotiating, I think there are two situations. Either you negotiate a contract with the customer and legal of the customer, and then it's more of a legal discussion. But if you go one size larger, even procurement is involved, and procurement is a combination of they focus on legal terms, they also focus on pricing, they focus on the pricing framework. And if you end up in that process without having already a robust framework in your mind, you're answering questions as you go, and you might end up with a transaction that you don't like in the end.
Yeah, but you can still walk away.
You always can walk away.
Yeah, I think that's something I see often with founders as well, that they're so afraid of the terms in the contracts, not realizing they also have power.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And I think for founders, it's important to make a distinction between two sets of problematic terms. The first set of problematic terms are terms that are applicable to your relationship with that specific customer. And then you can opt to do a deal you don't like. We typically see, for example, if we do due diligence on technology companies for investors, we always know that the first customer agreements are typically not run-of-the-mill and are things that you need to go the extra mile to get that customer in. But it's quite okay to do a bad deal with your first customer if it's contained to that first customer. And that can relate to the technology you still need to develop, that can relate to the pricing, that can even relate to your pricing framework or the way how you are calculating your pricing. But the second set of problematic terms are terms that not only impact the relationship you have with your customer, but might impact the relationship you have with other customers, and might impact the relationship you have with investors or future investors. And that is typically something that you need to be willing to walk away. having a first customer that can really weigh in on your development team, that can really demand for functionalities, but at the same time also asks for a most favored nation, being we have the ability to be your first and only client, or if we're not the only client, we definitely need to have always the best terms and the best pricing. Yeah, that's something that for an investor really is a red flag, because what you're doing now or within 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years really impacts your business model, really impacts your business plan, and those are terms that we typically, if it happens, may advise to clients, are you really sure to take that step?
Yeah, but at that time, often you're not at the table. If that are just for the first clients, or do I see that wrong?
That depends. I think certain clients of ours already engage us for that first customer as well. It depends on sector. I think certain sectors, certain customers of our clients already signal that this is a heavy contract by sharing a contract with 17 annexes, a document of 140 pages. Clients of ours then typically call us.
Is there one thing that's so obvious for you that founders should know?
Yeah, I think the most obvious for us is that pricing is more than a number. What we try to assist our clients in is that the number itself is very important, but how that translates into a broader framework, meaning it's linked to a scope, it's linked to a term, it's linked to the variability you have to amend your pricing. That framework itself is as important as the number. And what we see is when founders are selling, they tend to focus on the number, and that's also what the client wants to hear. But the question, of course, is that number, how does that translate into the scope you're selling? How are we going to address that at the end of this year or the year after? So that really for us is the thing we ask. Because at the end of the day, for me, it doesn't really matter. The number itself and the contract doesn't really matter to me. But as legal, the whole framework around that is super important, because we know if you look into discussions after a year on pricing, it's not about the number, it's how are we translating that number onto new functionalities and into a new year or into a new year.
Yeah. And then pricing services, products, different contracts, can that be one? Is a separate scope of work versus a...
It can definitely be part of one contract, especially if you look into products that require implementation or customization. So it definitely can be part of one contract. But the question brings it down to, you have a number or you have a pricing mechanism, to what is that linked? It's just scoping. Mm-hmm. And I think scoping, of course, of fixed projects or T&M is a different story than really selling a product and the pricing mechanisms there. But you can definitely combine them into a contract. The challenge, of course, is if you're combining them into a contract, you have more buckets. Client can have more negotiations on, was this part of the product, was this part of the professional services? But that's not really a pricing discussion, it's rather a scoping discussion.
Yeah, right? Yeah, but founders often they think about pricing, they think about...
It's a combination. It's a combination.
For them it's a combination of what they offer, but it could be separated as well, so to say. For example, a customer that says my contract ends every year, mm-hmm. and customers have to recommit every year again, because that gives us the full flexibility. But
yeah, I think the answer to that is a bit double, in the sense that customers that are aware or have bad experience with vendor lock-in are very wary on the ability to readjust your pricing any year or any given year. That being said, one thing that's quite often overlooked is the power that a founder has at the end of a contract. Because typically what you'll see is annual contracts are being renewed tacitly every year, unless they're stopped 3 months in advance, for example. Founders often forget that they have the same right. It's typically looked into from the commitment question, where you say, okay, we only have a commitment of a year with renewal. So the customer only gives a commitment to a year. In most cases, that clause is mutual. The founder as well, or the startup as well, has the right to say, I don't want to renew. So what you could do, and that's also something that we advise in certain cases is to talk to your customer 4 months in advance and say, this for us doesn't work anymore. This is a new pricing within 4 months. Either we terminate next month or we agree to a new pricing. That's of course something that's not advisable to do every year, but could help if, for example, you weren't able to clearly document which modules or which functionalities you're selling, and you have the feeling that you're being squeezed into selling a much broader and valuable product to the same old pricing. That's definitely something you could do. And it's also something that we advise against to make very explicit in the contract, because if you negotiate a contract and you already foresee explicitly, I want to talk to you every year, 4 months in advance to be able to stop the contract, implicitly in a tacit renewal system, it's already in there. But making that explicit also typically triggers a reaction from the customer at that point in time.
Yeah, at that point in time.
When you're negotiating.
When you're negotiating. One of my clients said, yeah, we do services on one side, we do the product on the other side. Product runs for a long period, services is based on scopes and others. If the contract of the software, I don't like it, I just raise my prices for the services 10x just to force negotiation at the table. Stupid, makes sense.
That's not a legal question. It's more of a business sense, whether you want to be that partner that really weaponize the one variable thing you have in hand. Of course, in certain situations, it can be the only way out. But of course, what I said in the beginning on procurement departments trying to fixate you on each and every pricing element you have is also triggered by parties that are really aggressive on certain elements in their pricing. Because as a confident startup, you need to trust in the fact that your technology is top and that customers won't walk away for a small pricing adjustment. So it really is finding a balance in what can we use to create a growing business and a growing commercial model. And of course, pricing is one of the elements there, but it's not my style to really weaponize certain elements in a pricing discussion to squeeze it on another one.
Yeah, but if the other one is blocked, then that could be a weapon to use.
That could be.
Is procurement so bad overall, or is it really just trying, okay?
Procurement isn't bad. Procurement has its role, especially if you look into how those companies are construed and how they need to interact with thousands of suppliers. Working with a customer that has procurement just has specific challenges. It tends to require a lot of stakeholder management. For example, if there are, in many cases, the business owners or the sponsors of the transaction itself are Europe-based or US-based. A lot of procurement currently is being offshored, so you're working with procurement departments based in India. Getting to manage those stakeholders and make sure that everybody wants to do a deal at a certain pace, because of course pace is also something that annoys everyone in those kinds of transactions. That's challenging to work with that kind of procurement transactions, especially given the fact that they typically have a kind of, this is how we do things. They have a template to work with a software vendor. But in many cases, the way they work with a local Flemish-based startup of 4 people, their template is the same as talking to Microsoft or Oracle. So it really is a question on how to steer that discussion and to keep on focusing on those elements that A, are important to you, and B, those elements that you're not able to do. If the question is to be an IT type Fort Knox, nobody in Belgium will be able to address that as a small startup. But you will also have to swallow certain elements that are not nice to have, but are must-haves.
And is there a way to bypass procurement? In pricing, you can start small and try to sell something.
The land and expand.
Yeah, land and expand in pricing. Yeah. Can you do that contractually as well to maybe?
That's something we sometimes try to do, but land and expand is something that typically works from a commercial perspective, but for example, from a security or data governance model doesn't work, because they typically say, okay, unless you're doing a small proof of concept with dummy data, then you're off the hook. But as of certain business sensitive data or personal data enters into the system, this is the standard we need. And that's not something you can steer away from, whether it's a small or a large deal. And that makes it typically quite hard, because you commercially, you start with a land and expand and you just want to be in and you want to do a deal. But their IT security, compliance, everything that's company or enterprise-wide on their side is already imputed on a small deal. So that is a bit of a disbalance sometimes.
Okay, cool. Because I have a founder that tells me the story that he managed to sell 6-8 months into chemical industry, very low ticket sizes, and then gets a call after 6 months, you're not on our books, you're not a right vendor. And then by that, he bypasses the whole system.
Yeah, it depends on the company and the sectors. And of course, and what we do see on land and expand is that you're able to sell smaller projects under certain thresholds, but typically T&M. So professional services, and you try to sell your proof of concept more as I'm selling services here. Once you get into I'm selling I'm a product vendor, then it typically becomes hard.
But it can be that due to the T&M relationship, a time and material relationship, you already have a relationship that you bypass a lot of complexity that you otherwise would go in.
Yeah, and typically procurement isn't involved in small scoped professional services engagement. Once you cross the threshold, or once you want to sell a product, then they're triggered and they come with, this is our exhibit on IT security, this is our exhibit on data privacy, this is our exhibit on whatever, ESG and other things like that. And then it becomes quite heavy. But typically founders and startups being active in that sector is something they need to get accustomed to, because there's no easy way to sell into chemical, or there is no easy way to sell into pharma without that setup.
Maybe question about AI today. A lot changes in that market. If you use that in your product, or that is your product, how do you take that with? Because everything is changing. It's quicksand almost.
It's quicksand, and everybody's struggling currently. We do have a lot of clients that are thinking that are struggling with their pricing related to this specifically. Not on the, I think on the product side, it's more manageable in the sense that it's under the hood and it's something that they started off with managing, and they know what they're using, and they know how to forecast their token usage and things like that. What I do see is a lot of professional services or professional services plus product companies are a bit struggling with that, because if you are working for customers and clients, everybody says, I want you to use AI. First question is security wise. A lot of their customers are really risk averse. So business wants you to use AI. The companies themselves are holding back because of IT security and data integrity and privacy. And then the next question is pricing wise, because nobody that enters into a 3-year engagement now for a huge budget of professional services with AI usage is willing to take any commitment on what that would mean on AI license fees, AI usage fees. Nobody knows.
So what do you do?
I think be very transparent. It's contractually, it's perfectly fine to keep in the variability. It's in a certain way, it's some kind of commodity that you're also using and selling as a raw material into your offering. So having that visibility towards your client can help to get some variability in. But of course, it's not in everybody's advantage to be very transparent on which AI or technology you're using. So it's always finding a balance.
Okay, but you can do that.
I think so.